Matthew 15. Matthew 15 opens with the Pharisees once again making an accusation to Jesus about his disciples. And they notice this time that Jesus' disciples don't wash up before meals. Matthew 15 verses 1 and 2 say, "Then the Pharisees and scribes came to Jesus from Jerusalem and said, 'Why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders? For they do not wash their hands when they eat.'" It was the custom of the Pharisees to wash their hands before eating. This was not out of concern for personal hygiene necessarily. It was in case they had even unknowingly come into contact with something that would have been considered ritually unclean while they were sort of out and about. Now, they don't say here that this was a violation of the law of Moses. They don't say you're breaking Torah by doing this. Rather, they say that this breaks what they call the tradition of the elders. So these are the additional rules that the Pharisees have been adding, and the disciples are not following these particular regulations. But in his response, what Jesus does is he actually turns the tables on them in this next verse. He answered them, "And why do you break the commandment of God for the sake of your tradition?" And so Jesus is saying if his disciples are not keeping the traditions of the elders, well, they are not keeping the commandments of God so that they can follow their traditions instead. And this is what can happen with man-made traditions sometimes. Keeping them becomes so important to us that we actually even become willing in our lives to violate things that God has actually told us to do in order to hold to these particular traditions. Jesus gives them an example of how they do this. As we move on in Matthew 15, the fifth commandment, honor your father and mother. But the Pharisees would allow a person to get out of financially supporting their parents by vowing that financial support as a gift to God instead. But God is not pleased with an offering like that. Honoring your parents is more important than giving to charity or to your church, would be one of the applications that we would draw here from Matthew 15 and also the parallel in Mark 7. Jesus then quotes something to them from Isaiah. He says, "You hypocrites, well did Isaiah prophesy of you when he said, 'This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men.'" Now, the Pharisees were engaged in what we might call lip service, right? They would carefully perform all of these, their outward rituals, but that was not an accurate reflection of their hearts in God's eyes. Right? Their hearts were actually, while they're doing all of this stuff, their hearts are really far away. And their worship, Jesus says, was ultimately empty because the things they taught were merely the made-up commandments of men. And we can fall into these same traps in the Christian life as well. Don't think for a moment that we're immune from this, my friends. We can go through all of our religious rituals, all while our hearts are actually frighteningly far away from God, the God that we profess to worship. Then Jesus rocks the boat even more. The Pharisees were concerned about ritual and ceremonial purity. They don't want anything external to make them unclean, but they've got it the wrong way around, Jesus says. And he called the people to him and said to them, "Hear and understand, it is not what goes into the mouth that defiles a person, but what comes out of the mouth. This defiles a person." Now, to any good Pharisee who knew their Hebrew Bible, this would be a stunning claim, right? Of course, there were things that could make a person unclean. They would have said, Moses gave us a whole list of them. You can go back to your Old Testament and read them. They're in Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14. Jesus' disciples let him know that this saying really upset the Pharisees, and Jesus tells them not to bother with the Pharisees. Let them alone, Jesus says. They're blind guides, and if the blind lead the blind, both will fall into a pit. Right? Who do you want to lead someone who is blind? Someone who can see. Right? What happens if the people who are leading the spiritually blind are themselves spiritually blind? Right? They both end up in trouble. And that's what's going on with the Pharisees here. And how many people in churches today similarly have blind guides? They have pastors and shepherds who are not tethered in any way to what Scripture is saying. Peter then asked Jesus to explain his saying about what really defiles a person. Peter calls the saying a parable, by the way, if you're interested in that. And Jesus seems a little surprised that they don't get it. And he said, are you also still without understanding? Do you not see that whatever goes into the mouth passes into the stomach and is expelled? But what comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart, and this defiles a person. Right? So when you eat something, it goes into your stomach and eventually it passes out of your system, doesn't it? That's the reason that it doesn't defile, Jesus says. Okay, now, the conversation, especially as recorded by Matthew, focuses on eating without washing your hands. That's our overall context here. But the logic that Jesus uses here would necessarily extend beyond this. Okay, so you touch food with unwashed hands. And Jesus says this doesn't defile you when you eat it because eventually it passes out of your system. Okay, but that's true even if you're eating food that the Old Testament classified as unclean. That's what's important here, right? This same thing applies in both cases, right? The same logic applies to both of these kinds of situations. You can't argue this over here and something different over there. And so Mark's gospel, if we look at the parallel in Mark 7, Mark's gospel makes it absolutely clear that this statement of Christ has implications in this area about what we're allowed to eat as well. Mark 17:9 explains in the middle of Jesus' talk here, Mark says, thus he declared all foods clean. Okay, so what you eat doesn't defile you, Jesus says, but there is something that does. Okay, the things that we say, our speech, the stuff coming out of our mouths, rather than the stuff that's going in, that stuff, Jesus says, has its origin in our hearts. Okay, and so once again, we see Jesus saying that our words are a reflection of our heart, right? And that does produce defilement, according to Christ. And Jesus goes on to say that not just our foul words, but all kinds of sinful things spring out of the heart. For out of the heart come, here we go, evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false witness, slander. These are what defile a person, but to eat without unwashed hands does not defile anyone. Okay, so where did that adulterous liaison start? It started in the heart, right? Where does slandering another person spring from? It springs from the heart, right? And this is quite a list, and it's not meant to be exhaustive. These are just examples. Mark adds coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, envy, slander. Matthew had also mentioned slander, pride, foolishness. All right, I think that all of us are convicted here at some point, right? One of these is bound to make you go, ouch. So the Pharisees' initial concern about hand washing before meals, Jesus would say a person is not defiled from the outside in by, say, food that's been touched with unwashed hands, right? They are rather defiled by sin from the inside out. The Pharisees have it exactly the wrong way around. Now, after this, Matthew's gospel recounts an incident between Jesus and a Gentile woman. Jesus travels north to the area where the cities of Tyre and Sidon were located. He is now thick in Gentile territory. There is a woman there who has a daughter who is demon oppressed. And when she learns that Jesus is there, she goes and she keeps crying out to him to save her daughter. And interestingly enough, Jesus does not respond to her at all at first. And the disciples want Jesus to quote, send her away. And Jesus replies to them, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. But she came and knelt before him, saying, Lord, help me. And he answered, it is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. This is a pretty pointed, even insulting comment. You have to understand that in the first century, Jews would refer to Gentiles as dogs. This is a racial epithet, essentially. So if Jesus is sent to the people of Israel, he's saying then for him to heal this woman's daughter would be like throwing the children's bread to the dogs. It's hard for us to understand how loving, kind, gentle Jesus could respond in this way. Just a few chapters back, he had healed a centurion's servant, even noting at that time that there would be many Gentiles in the kingdom. Well, many Jews were cast out. That was back in Matthew chapter 8. Now, there are many interpreters then who see Jesus as involved in kind of a friendly banter with this woman here. Elton Trueblood, an older New Testament scholar, wrote a whole book called The Humor of Christ, where he focuses in on this aspect of Jesus, and he devotes the whole final chapter of that book to this particular encounter between Jesus and this woman. And Trueblood sees in this an example of, as he says, the humor of Christ. And that may be the case. It would certainly answer some of our difficulties that we have with the story. On the other hand, if Jesus said this in all seriousness, rather than perhaps, let's say, with a little smile on his face, it might be helpful to remember where he's at in ministry at this particular historical moment. So Jesus is intentionally focusing on Israel right now. Even when he sent his disciples out in Matthew chapter 10, he told them, "Go nowhere among the Gentiles and enter no town of the Samaritans, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." The Apostle Paul is later going to tell us in the book of Romans, years later when Paul writes Romans, in Romans 1:16, he tells us that salvation is first for the Jew and then for the Gentile. And so for this woman to appeal to Jesus in this way was a little bit like skipping her place in line, if I can change the analogy to a little bit more of a gentle picture here. And so it's not that Jesus is necessarily unwilling to help her, perhaps, but it might be that he does want her to recognize exactly what it is that she is asking when she brings him this request. I was helped here tremendously by R.T. France in his commentary on Matthew. And he may, of course, even done this in a way that invited or even encouraged her to push back on his comment. And, my friends, push back she does. Rather than being offended, the woman actually does something remarkable. She takes Jesus' own analogy and flips it into a counterpoint in the next verse. She said, "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." And what she's saying here is, yes, the dogs do get the stuff that falls. She's not agreeing with Jesus here. This is actually a contradiction of what he says. Yes, this is right to do this, Lord, is what this means, yet shouldn't be there in the ESV. It's not in the Greek. It's a mistranslation that kind of gives us a wrong sense of this. What she's doing here, she's turning the tables on Jesus. This is the only example that I know of in the Gospels. Jesus always has the upper hand verbally with everybody that he interacts with in the Gospels. This is the only time that anyone ever sort of, if I can say it reverently, beats him at his own game, right? And that's what this woman does, right? And so think about it, right? We frequently see dogs hanging around tables, don't we? Right? Maybe something's going to fall to the ground and they're going to get it. That's the analogy that they use here. And sometimes, interestingly enough, they even beg. My folks had a dog named Bella. She was one of the cutest things in the world. I asked my parents if I could share the story. My mom said yes. The condition was she had to provide the pictures. So this was Bella as a puppy. This is her when she's a little bit older. She didn't normally look that mean, but she's the cutest little dog in the world. And my dad had this rule in the house. He absolutely insisted that she not be fed from the table. And, we abided by that. And then some family members who will not be named to protect the guilty began to feed Bella from the table. And they ruined this animal. Bella would sit there as you ate on the ground, and she would look up at you begging for food, and she might start to whimper a little bit. And then if you didn't give her something, she would actually start to bark at you, right? Kind of like, if I can be a little edgy for a moment, the woman was doing here with Jesus at the beginning of the story, right? If I can extend Jesus's already edgy analogy a little bit here. I'm a Gentile too, guys, all right? Like I'm telling a Polish joke, right? My last name ends in ski, okay? Jesus is impressed. Then Jesus answered her, "O woman, great is your faith. Let it be done for you as you desire." And her daughter was healed instantly. After this, we see Jesus back down south by the Sea of Galilee. He heals a ton of people. Matthew just sort of summarizes that here for us, and the people are amazed and they give glory to God. And Matthew 15 ends with yet another miraculous feeding of a large crowd. This time the head count for men is a little bit smaller. There's 4,000 guys there, plus the women and children. There are a couple of more loaves available. There's 7 instead of just 5. I don't know how to do the comparison on the fish the way the Gospels describe it. But still, this miracle is very, very impressive. And there are 7 baskets of leftovers this time. Then we move into Matthew 16. And at the beginning of Matthew 16, we see the Pharisees, again, asking for a sign. And this time, remarkably, the Sadducees are with them. And the Pharisees and the Sadducees, they had a lot of disagreements amongst themselves. And so it's remarkable to see them together on this. Maybe you've heard the saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And it looks like there's maybe a teeny tiny little bit of that going on here. This time, Jesus points out to them that they are able to do some simple weather forecasting by how the sky looks in the evening or in the morning, but they've not been able to do the same thing with the events that are happening around them. These events are signs to them that they are completely missing. And then he tells them again that the only sign that they are going to get is the sign of Jonah, which is, of course, ultimately pointing to Jesus' death and resurrection. We talked about that last week from Matthew 12. Then we have an exchange between Jesus and his disciples. When the disciples reached the other side, they had forgotten to bring any bread. Jesus said to them, "Watch and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees." And they began discussing it among themselves, saying, "We brought no bread." Mark tells us there's only one single loaf of bread there. That doesn't go very far among all of those guys. And the disciples seem to think that the statement that Jesus makes relates to that situation in some way. But that's not what Jesus meant at all. He goes and reminds them of all the leftovers that were present each time in those huge crowds that were fed. And then he says to them, "How is it that you fail to understand that I did not speak about bread? Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees," he repeats. Then they understood that he did not tell them to beware of the leaven of bread, but of the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees. All right, they get it. It clicks, at least this time. Then we have the account of Peter's great confession of Jesus. Now, Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi. He asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." And Jesus asks them this question then about who people think he is, and apparently there are all kinds of ideas that are floating around about who Jesus was. And even today, many people make all kinds of claims about who Jesus was. This is a question that is every bit as pertinent for us today. Who is it that people say that Jesus is today? Well, some people say that he was a good man with good teaching, but really nothing more than that. Some people are willing to own him as a prophet of God. Others dismiss him as a magician or a deceiver. Some will claim that he was a New Age guru. Others have suggested that he was a traveling cynic philosopher. There are even those, in odd, wacky little corners of the internet who would claim that he is an alien from another world. All of these, believe it or not, are claims that have been advanced about Jesus. But at the end of the day, for you personally, the thing that really matters is not what other people think about Jesus. It's what you say about Christ. And Jesus is going to press his disciples on this next. He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" And this is a question that confronts each one of us, right? Who do we say that Jesus is? How do you think his disciples are going to answer? Simon Peter replied, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus answered him, Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. Peter declares Jesus to be the Christ, the Messiah, foreseen in the Old Testament, and the Son of God. And Jesus says that the Father is actually the one that has revealed this to him. Peter doesn't come up with this on his own. This is revelation to him that's been given to him by God. And Jesus goes on to tell Peter that Peter's role in Christ building his church is going to be foundational, let's say. And then what he does in verse 20 is he tells his disciples to keep this quiet. Then he strictly charged the disciples to tell no one that he was the Christ. Then Jesus starts to tell them what messiahship is really going to look like for him. You see, the disciples had a particular idea of what Messiah was going to do. He's going to come. He's going to liberate Israel. He is going to overthrow the Romans. He's going to immediately usher in peace on earth. This would have been their conception. When Peter says that Jesus is the Christ, these are the things in the back of Peter's mind that he's going to be expecting Jesus to do. And Jesus then tells them plainly that he is going to have to suffer and die, but then he will be resurrected on the third day. And Peter, who had just had this shining moment when he confessed Jesus as Christ and Son of God, he now shows that he doesn't entirely get it. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, Far be it from you, Lord, this shall never happen to you. Right now, can you imagine correcting Jesus? Right? What you just said, Lord, no, that can't possibly be right. They know that he is the Christ, the Messiah, but their cultural expectations of that role make it really hard to understand that Jesus has to suffer and die. And Jesus' response to Peter is striking. But he turned and said to Peter, Get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man. Ouch. Earlier, Peter was speaking something that had been revealed to him by God the Father. But this time, it is the devil who actually stands behind the statement that Peter made. Then Jesus makes sure that his disciples know that following him is going to involve a cross for them as well. Then Jesus told his disciples, If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. Okay, remember what we said about discipleship. Discipleship involves becoming like Jesus. These are guys that are going to follow him around, model him, try to become as like him as they possibly can. But Jesus is going to the cross. So for those following him, if they wish to become like him, they must also take up their cross as well. That's what this means. Now, it's hard for this to hit us the same way that it would have hit Jesus' listeners in the first century, you see, because for us, the cross has such positive associations. When we see someone walking down the street and they're wearing a cross on their neck, we think about life. We think about God's love. We think about salvation, right? We've got a giant cross right here that we look at every week. Okay, there's no scandal in this for us, right? But the cross, you need to understand, was about being executed. It was about being executed in a really, really painful, we would even say excruciating way. And yes, that word excruciating comes from this practice of crucifixion. And so maybe the best that I can do so that this hits us in a similar way would be, if you want to follow Jesus, you better get ready to strap yourself into your electric chair. That would be sort of the 21st century cultural equivalent of what Jesus says here. Discipleship, at least initially, means death. At the very least, it means dying to ourselves and being willing to follow Christ to literal physical death if that becomes necessary. R.T. France, again, was helpful here in his commentary on Mark. He said, such self-denial is on a different level altogether from giving up chocolates for Lent. That is a helpful reminder as we move into the Lenten season this week, isn't it? Right? There is a certain sense, my friend, in which the whole of Christian life is supposed to be Lent, right? And not just giving up individual things like chocolates or desserts or television or whatever it is, right? But giving up our whole selves to Christ. That is what Jesus is talking about here. But here's the hope. You see, this is the beautiful part of the picture. Because Jesus is going to be raised, following him to the cross also means resurrection life. We don't stay in the grave. He brings us back to life again. That is what baptism symbolizes, by the way. We just acted this out with 4 people, didn't we? When they go down into the water, that's death. That's a symbolic burial. And when they come back up, what is that? That's a resurrection. It's a resurrection. So Jesus says that the one who loses his life for Christ will find it. He continues on, for what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? Or what shall a man give in return for his soul? For the Son of Man is going to come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and then he will repay each person according to what he has done. Truly, I say to you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. This is one of those perplexing statements of Jesus for us now, 2,000 years later, and he has apparently not yet come in this way, so it seems. And many interpreters believe, and I think that they're right, that in verse 28, Jesus is actually predicting something that would happen within a week. Do you think that that's wild? Right? Jesus is going to go up on a mountain where 3 of his disciples, not the whole group, but 3 of his disciples are going to watch as he is suddenly standing there in shining brightness before their eyes. None of the rest of the disciples are going to get to see that kind of thing before they die. But these 3 guys, Peter, James, and John, are going to get this little preview, let's say, of Jesus coming in glory. When you watch a movie trailer, are you genuinely watching part of the movie? Yeah, you are. It's just a preview. But you're genuinely seeing parts of that film. And this is going to happen at the beginning of Matthew 17. Matthew 17:1 says, after 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John, his brother, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. So the time marker, 6 days, is important here. It ties this event to what Jesus had just said. Jesus makes this prediction about some of his disciples getting to see him in his kingdom before they die. And then 6 days later, this remarkable event happens in Matthew, and I believe as Mark as well, and Luke as well, that they want us to see this as the fulfillment of those words. Right, so what happens on this mountain? Something amazing. It says, and he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became white as light. And then all of a sudden, Moses as well as Elijah are there, and they're having a conversation with Jesus. And the parallel passage in Luke tells us that the conversation is about Jesus' approaching exodus, okay, meaning his death. And that language is absolutely intentional. We went into detail on how Christ fulfills the Exodus when we were on the Exodus account back in August, and you can look that video up if you're interested. Now, Peter, always seeming to be needing to do something, asks if they should build shelters for Jesus, Moses, and Elijah. Like, what do you say in a situation like that? Mark says, for he did not know what to say, for they were terrified. Indeed. Okay, but then suddenly things get even more intense. There is this bright cloud than we see in Matthew 17:5. It says, he was still speaking, referring to Peter, when, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and a voice from the cloud said, this is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him. God the Father himself testifies about Jesus here. Earlier, we learned that he had revealed Jesus' identity as Christ and Son to Peter, and now he speaks directly to these 3 disciples about Jesus. right? Earlier, we asked the question of who men say Jesus is, but this is who God the Father says that Jesus is. Jesus is his beloved Son, and the disciples are told that they need to listen to him. Do you know that Jesus is the Son of God? If you do you listen to him? Do you listen to him? Now, of course, this whole thing is frightening for Peter, James, and John. When the disciples heard this, they fell on their faces and were terrified. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, "Rise and have no fear." And when they lifted up their eyes, they saw no one but Jesus only. So the entire thing is over just as suddenly as it had begun. And many years later, Peter is going to recall this incident. We have a comment that he made about this in a letter that he wrote to other Christians later in his life. That letter is now in the Bible. We call it 2 Peter. Peter said to them, this is Peter writing, "We did not follow cleverly devised myths when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. For when he received honor and glory from God the Father, and the voice was borne to him by the majestic glory, 'This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased,' we ourselves heard this very voice borne from heaven, for we were with him on the holy mountain." And so as you read the gospel accounts, sometimes you might ask yourself the question, how do I know that this is true? How do we know that the story of the Transfiguration is true? I mean, Matthew records it for us, Mark records it for us, Luke records it for us. None of those three guys were actually present at this event, right? It was only Peter, James, and John. But we actually have the firsthand testimony of Peter himself in a letter from the first century saying, "Hey guys, I was there. I saw this." Peter would talk about this openly later, but for the moment, at this stage in Jesus' ministry, he was not allowed. Going back to the Gospel of Matthew, and it says, as they were coming down the mountain, Jesus commanded them, "Tell no one the vision until the Son of Man is raised from the dead." And then I love the little additional detail that Mark 9 gives us. Mark 9:10 says, "So they kept the matter to themselves, questioning what this rising from the dead might mean." So guys, rising from the dead. What do you think he meant by that? I get it, right? Jesus often spoke in very figurative ways. The disciples had just been rebuked in the previous chapter when they didn't understand that a reference to leaven wasn't really about bread. But Jesus had told them plainly, quite recently, that he was going to be raised after being killed. And Peter had been rebuked sternly for contradicting Jesus when he told them about these events. And so what did Jesus mean when he said that he would be raised from the dead? He meant that he would be raised from the dead. Plain and simple. The disciples then asked Jesus a question, and the disciples asked him, "Then why do the scribes say that first Elijah must come?" He answered, "Elijah does come, and he will restore all things. But I tell you that Elijah has already come, and they did not recognize him, but did to him whatever they pleased. So also the Son of Man will certainly suffer at their hands." And this time the disciples get it, Matthew tells us. They do get it sometimes, we've seen. And if you've been following the story, do you get it? Do you know who Jesus is talking about here? That's right. This is about John the Baptist. And Jesus is saying that the same kind of thing is going to happen to him that happened to John. But when Jesus and Peter and James and John come back down the mountain, they encounter quite a stir in Matthew 17. And I'm going to sort of leave that there as a cliffhanger for you for next week. A little hint, you can go home. You can cheat. You don't have to wait till next week to find out what happens. You can go home and open your Bible and read Matthew 17 today if you want to. I won't stop you from doing that. I'm going to encourage you to do that. But we're going to pick up the story there next week. But we've encountered quite a bit today, haven't we? We've heard Peter's confession of Jesus as Christ and Son of God. We've heard God the Father himself call him his beloved Son. So I have two questions for you. First, do you believe these testimonies about Jesus? How would you respond to Jesus' question to his disciples in Matthew 16:15? Who do you say that I am? And if you do believe these things about Jesus, the second question is, are you willing to follow him? In the true sense of everything that means, are you willing to follow him even to the point of death on the cross? That may sound hard. That may sound difficult, but we have an incredible promise of Christ that if we will follow him, he will give to us a glorious resurrection as well. You see, it's all part of becoming like Jesus. Let's pray.